In this video, you're going to learn how to texture cars in Blender, starting from this beautiful Aston Martin Valhalla I modeled in my previous videos. It is going to be very easy to do, so if you're new to Blender, don't worry. I'll try to explain myself the better I can. Finally, you can find all the textures I used during this video on my Patreon channel completely for free, so make sure to get them if you want to follow this tutorial. Also, consider leaving a like and following this channel if you'd like to see other videos like this in the future. This said, let's start texturing. Here's what we have done in the previous videos. Now to start coloring it, we have to create some light. I created one area light on top of the car and made it bigger to fit the size of the car in order to get a uniform lighting base across all the scene. Then I added two more lights on the sides to illuminate the wheels and the rest of the model. I made the light on the top brighter than the others to get a more dramatic light, even though I think I'm going to add some more later on. Now we'll have to organize our Blender viewport so we can create our materials while we can see how they change our model in real time. To divide your viewport into two separate areas, position your cursor on one of the corners of the screen and drag it away until you like to. I find myself comfortable working with my shader editor on the bottom half of the screen, but you can customize your workspace however you want. Finally, it's time we start making the main color of our car, which I'm going to name Car Paint. I started to make our material by adding a layer weight node connected to a color ramp, then to a mix color node in the factor input to create a blended material between two colors. For these ones, I chose a light blue and a bright purple. Then to add the flakes to our painting, I added a Voronoi texture, on which I attached some texture mapping nodes using the Node Wrangler add-on. I want to remind you that if you don't have the Node Wrangler enabled, you can click on the Edit tab on top of the screen, select Preferences, search for add-ons in this window, and type Node Wrangler in the search bar to enable it. Then use Ctrl+T to add the texture mapping nodes I mentioned earlier. Also, I forgot to say, you should set the texture coordinates to object other than generated. Now that we have our Voronoi texture setted, we can add a glossy BSDF, which is going to make our flakes more visible and shiny. Set the roughness to 0 and add a color ramp between these two nodes right here, so that we can control the amount of flakes we want to see. Bring the black almost at the end of the ramp and decrease the brightness on the other part. If we connect this material into our output, we can observe that our flakes are way too big to be seen, and that's why we'll need to increase the scale of our Voronoi texture. Choose the value which you prefer the most. Maybe you can't see that from the video, but I found myself satisfied with a value of 900. Now to merge our shaders together, simply use an Add Shader node. The only thing we need to do now is a sort of clear coat. To do that, I added a noise texture, which I mapped again by the object, and I setted the scale to something about 215. Now before we create a normal map with what we did here, I wanted to add another glossy shader to make our changes visible. To do that, I added a mixed shader node between these two nodes, connected the glossy on the bottom, and used a Fresnel node to regulate the factor. Then to complete the material, I simply disconnected the noise texture from the shader's color node and added a bump node to create a normal map for our glossy. Finally, I adjusted the bump strength and found that 0.01 is probably the best value to choose. Now that our material is finished, I want to make a node group so that it is easily editable. To make a node group, select all of our nodes with A and press Ctrl+G on your keyboard. Then use the Group Input node to add as many inputs as you want. I choose to put the metallic and roughness parameters from my principled BSDF, then my main colors and the scale of our Voronoi texture. I rename my group Car Paint on the right side of our shader editor, then switch to the Group section on this side menu and rename my inputs as I pleased. Once I finished renaming all of my inputs, I pressed Ctrl+Tab to exit my group, and I adjusted my metallic and roughness values. For the metallic, I put it 0.483, and for the roughness, I used 0.392. Now that we have our paint material, we have to apply it on all the parts of the car. To do that, just select one part on whatever object you want to color using L for looser seam parts, and create firstly a base blank material here in the Material tab on the Properties menu, Then create another material and select your car paint material from this drop-down menu to link this material to the object. To actually apply our material on our model, select the part you want to color, then with a material selected, click Assign in the bottom part of the materials list. Repeat the process for all the parts of the car that share this material. Then move on making the glass material for our headlights and windows. This one is going to be very simple. Just add a base material first, then add another one, name it glass, and select the glass surface type in the surface property. Set the roughness to 0, then link this material to any other parts. And now let's pass on making a reflective material for our rear view mirrors. To make this material, set the metallic to 1 and the roughness to 0, then open this specular part of this menu and switch the type from multi-scatter CGX to CGX. Obviously, don't forget to repeat the process on the other side. And now it's time to surround our car with carbon fiber. To create this material, we're going to use one of the materials you can find on my Patreon. Just get the color, metallic, normal, and roughness textures and drag them into the shader editor. Then connect all of these into the corresponding inputs into our principled BSDF shader, except for the normal map, which is going to be firstly connected to a normal map node. As you can see, our carbon fiber, it's not visible yet, and that's why I added another mapping node to one of our textures. Connect this node to all of the textures, then set the scale on all axes to 15 and switch the texture coordinates from UV to camera so you won't get any sort of distorted textures like these ones. Before coloring everything, I also wanted to make another black material for these parts here. I created it and called it simply black. Then for the base color, I was about to use a complete black, but then I changed my mind and went with a dark gray. I adjusted the metallic and roughness values to 0.327 and 0.464 respectively. Then to add a little more shininess, I got an imperfection texture from our texture folder, which I connected as a normal map into a glossy BSDF with no roughness that I simply mixed with the other shader we had done using a Fresnel node as a factor. Immediately afterwards, I started to apply all the materials we have made across all the car. I even made our carbon fiber brighter. As for me, it's pretty dark. To do that, I had to simply add a color ramp between the color texture and the shader's input. Then I increased the brightness here on the black. If you want, you can repeat the same process on the roughness map to get a shinier material. Obviously, you'll have to repeat the same process we did with our paint material to color all the parts of our car that are made out of carbon fiber. So I quickly went on coloring the front air intakes, then the mini skirts, the back part of the car except for the text logo, and finally the roof. Then with the materials I had, I colored other parts of the car. I used our car paint for the upper part of the rear view mirrors, then the black material for these squares and the exhaust. For the latter, I also created a very simple yellow material to color the inner part of the exhaust pipes. Note that to complete this operation, I had to apply all the modifiers. Then to select the faces I needed easily, I selected a face in the center of the pipe and pressed Ctrl and plus on the numpad to extend my selection by one face. Finally, our yellow material is going to be very, very easy. Just a bright yellow like we can see on the reference. After I had finished with the exhaust, I immediately passed on filling my spoiler with carbon fiber. Then, I went on making a shiny black for the windshield. I started from the black material we did earlier. Then I pressed this little button in the center of the screen, which separates the current instance of the material we're using into a completely new one, so that we can modify it independently from the others. To make our black more shiny, I simply decreased the roughness and increased the metallicness. And basically, most of our car is ready, but we need to add various details that will make our car more real, starting from our wheels. The first material we are going to do for this part is going to be a brushed metal, which is going to cover the outer part of our rim. I started creating it by adding a noise texture connected to some mapping nodes, Then I increased the scale of this texture, added a simple color ramp, which is going to make our image black and white, and plugged everything into the output to get a general idea on how our material should look. I think that these lines need to be more stretched, so I played around with scale and the noise textures values until I was satisfied. I suggest you to do the same. Once I had chosen the parameters for my texture, I plugged what I did into a bump node, then into the normal input of our shader with a value of 0.009 on the strength. Then I leave the base color to white, but increase the metallic, which made our material look more gray. Finally, I set the roughness to 0.274 and the IOR to 1 and passed on making the materials for the wheel's cap. You can see from the reference that we need a gold and a sort of black plastic material. To get a similar color to what you can see there, I used the eyedropper tool to get it directly from the image. Then I just increased the brightness a little bit. Once I had done that, I spreaded the color across the model. Then I increased the metallic and passed on, making the material for the cap, even though I'm going to modify this multiple times later on. Anyway, for the cap, I started from the black material we did earlier, but deleted everything except for the shader to preserve the base color I used. Then I set the metallic and the roughness roughly to 0.5, the IOR to 1.5, and even added a little bit of subsurface with a value of 0.025, which I think adds a little bit more realism to the wheel. Then you can see I modified the gold material for the first time. Basically, what I did was to decrease the roughness to 0.289 and the IOR to 2. Also, I added a simple noise texture in the normal map to add even more realism. Now we can pass on making a material for the rest of the wheel. I started from the material we just did for the cap, then I separated it and renamed it Rim Inside. Then I started selecting the faces I needed, which were basically all the ones that are not on the outside of the rim, and passed on editing the material. What I did was setting the metallicness to 0.676, the roughness to 0, and the IOR to 1.3. Finally, I added another noise texture as a bump map to make our reflections look more real. For the normal map, I used a scale on the noise texture of 257 and a bump strength of 0.018. Now that our rim is done, let's pass on making the tire. To do this, I firstly isolated my wheels by pressing Ctrl+I in object mode while selecting them, then pressed H to hide everything, and brought back the lights so that I could see something. In the last video, I've marked 2 seams on my tire, which are going to come really handy for the purpose of this video. Simply select this part with L and create a new material called tire. Then go back on the textures you can find on my Patreon and drag the textures for the color, normal, and roughness of our tire tread into the shader editor. Once you've done that, simply connect the color into the base color and roughness into the roughness input. Then for the normal, create a normal map node on which you connect the image texture and connect it to the normal input on our shader. You can see that our tire is starting to look pretty good, but it's way too dark and reflective. So I decreased the IOR to 1 and set the color space of our normal map to non-color so that our normal map won't influence the color of our material. Then even if we marked our seams correctly, you can notice that the texture is not covering all the tire tread. So to fix it, we're going to need another Blender tool called UV Editor, which allows us to modify the position of a texture on our object. If we select our tread in edit mode, you can see that our selection is projected into our UV editor as a UV map, which is basically the way the texture is displayed around our object. To modify the way our texture is applied on our object, we firstly need to unwrap it. So I went in top view, and with the tire tread selected, I pressed U, then project from view to get a projection of our viewport into the UV editor. Once you have done that, press U again and click Follow Active Quads so that our UV map gets pretty much unrolled. Now to actually modify our tire looks, remember to select everything with A, then rotate our map by 90 degrees and scale it up to fit our texture. The first part of our tire is done. Now we need to follow the same process for the sides. Create a new material and call it tire side, Then go back to our texture folder and drag these two textures into the shader editor from the tire side folder. If you try to connect the color into the shader, you can notice that our texture is not applied in the correct way. So to fix it, we'll need to do the same thing we did a few moments ago. Go into Side View, select the part you want to unwrap, then press U and project from view. On our UV editor, we have to change the image we want to see. So click on this image icon in the top right corner of the editor and select the image you are currently using. Then carefully adjust the position of your UV map using the same keys as in the Blender viewport. And as you can see, we now have our UV in place, so let's give some different colors and some depth to our tire. Start by adding a color ramp between these two nodes so that we can modify the colors of our texture. The whites are going to be of a dark gray so that our texts are visible, then pass on the normal map and add a bump node with a strain of 0.917 before connecting it into the shader. Remember to set the color space of our texture image to non-color. Finally, to make our tire look more realistic, I added another noise texture on top of the base color by using a mix node and a color ramp, but also added it to our normal map by using a bump node with a really low strain and an add vector node. And our tire is finally over, so press Alt+H in object mode to unhide the rest of the car. It's now time to deal with our brake discs. For this object, I'm going to make two materials, one for the disc itself and one for the part that holds onto the axle. For the first one, I selected the outer part of the disc and called the material disc as well. I got an instance of the brushed metal material we made earlier and got to work by decreasing the brightness of our color. Then I switched my mapping from object to UV, increased the strength of the normal map to see better what I'm doing, and passed on modifying the look of my texture in the UV editor. I wanted to make my texture look more circular, so I had to project my brake disc from my side view. Then I selected every face in the UV editor and made a sphere projection by pressing U again. I rotated my UV map and scaled it to fit the noise image. And here we have a noise pattern that seems more suitable for a brake disc. But our work with this material doesn't end here at all. We have to firstly rescale our texture image to get thinner lines across the material, and we have to decrease the strain of our normal to make it more subtle. I even decided to duplicate this noise texture to add another normal map to our material. After setting up our base texture, we need to add an opacity mask on the brake disc, which is basically a texture that creates the illusion of a hole inside of our object. The only problem with this is that our UV map is occupied by the texture we just modified, so we need to create another one. To do that, go into the Data tab in the Properties of our object, then search for UV maps and add one using the plus icon. Once you've done that, drag this texture from the texture folder to the shader editor and attach to it a UV map node with the UV map you just created linked to this node. Now preview this image in the UV editor and make sure that the name of your UV map appears here. Otherwise, click on it and select it. Finally, you'll just need to unwrap your faces again from side view to adjust your newly created UV map as needed and to connect this texture into the alpha channel of our principled BSDF. And now our brake has holes, but even after adjusting our UV map for a little bit, you can notice that there are some parts that remain quite buggy. So to fix it, you'll have to just pick all the faces loops that you want to fix one by one and either drag them to a white part of the texture or scale them down until they are imperceptible. Now, to ultimately complete our brake disc, we have to just color this part here in the center, which is going to be very easy. I used a copy of the brushed metal material we did earlier and called it Disc Inside, then simply lowered the brightness of my base color and setted the metallicness to 0.810. With this material, we have finished with the brake disc. Now let's make a very simple material for these bolts and pass on texturing the brake caliper. Very simple. Just put the metallicness to 1 and the roughness to 0.173. Before passing to the next car part, I didn't like the color of this cap, so I remade it by getting the color of my brake caliper with the eyedropper tool, then by playing with the saturation and value, setting them to 0.535 and 0.471 respectively. And now it's time for our brake caliper. This part is going to be a little more difficult because if we want to position the Aston Martin logo, we need to modify the topology so we don't get any kind of distortion. But let's firstly focus on giving a base color to our caliper. If you notice, the cap we recolored earlier has the same color as the brake caliper, so I just went on the material we modified earlier, copied the hex code of the base color, and pasted it in our other material. To make the process easier, I suggest you to just get a copy of that material. Now return to your texture folder and get the text logo from the brakes folder, then enter in edit mode to modify your caliper. As you see, our model is formed by irregular faces that need to be adjusted in order to be useful. Pick these 10 faces in the middle and inset them so that we can work easily. Now put your 3D cursor on this vertex and select the rest. Then press S plus X plus 0 to straighten them on the X-axis and repeat the same process with the other part. Once you've done that, bring these vertices at the same height with S plus Z plus 0 and use the space loop tool to square your faces. Now that our topology is done correctly, we can connect the image in the normal map of our shader and unwrap the faces we just modeled to position them on our logo. Select everything in the UV editor, then rotate it by 270 degrees to get the correct text orientation and move the UV map to fit the image. Finally, add a loop cut here to straighten the text even more, and your brake caliper is ready. Maybe I'll add just a simple color ramp to get a higher contrast between the text and the rest of the caliper so that it becomes more noticeable. And with this one, our wheels are ready, so let's obviously duplicate them on the back part of the car. Select all the back parts of the wheels in object mode and press Delete to delete them, then select all the parts we just made, press Shift plus D and position our new tires in place so that we can now texture our beautiful headlights. To start texturing the headlights of our car, you'll firstly need to learn how to create the normal map for the inside of the headlights chamber. So let me show you that. Create a new plane next to our car and add a good amount of horizontal loop cuts. Now to create our desired shape, select all the edges parallel to the X-axis, and here on the top of the screen press Select, then checker deselect. Once you've done that, bring these edges up a little bit and the shape of our normal map is done. But now we need to transform this into an actual image. Add another plane and place it underneath this object. Then create a material on the plane we just modified and add an image texture node. Now add an image from this button and call it however you want. Then click OK and highlight it in your shader editor by clicking on it. Now firstly select the plane underneath, then the other one, and go in your render properties to search for the bake settings. To bake this normal, you'll have to set the extrusion to 0.1 and the bake type to normal, then hit bake and wait for the image to render. While our image is loading, I have to inform you that to do the operation we just did, you'll have to set your render engine to cycles, unless you won't be able to bake textures. And here we have our freshly baked normal map. To save it in your computer, click here on Image and select the directory on which you want your image to appear. Now that we have our normal map, simply delete these objects and go into Material Preview mode so that we can focus on our headlights. Create a new material for the inside of our chamber, then go into Edit mode and carefully select all the faces except obviously for the front part and assign our newly created material to them. Then move to the shader editor and drag in the image we did a few moments ago. Set the color space to non-color, decrease the brightness of the base color, increase the roughness to 1, and set the IOR to 1.2. Once you've done that, connect the normal to our shader with a bump node. You can see that our normal had no effect. That's because you need to add a mapping texture node to switch your coordinates to object and set the scale to 50 on all axes. Now unhide everything and go back to the rendered view. Unfortunately, we can't see the changes made by our material, but don't worry, once we finish texturing the headlights, the result will be fantastic. Select the other part of our headlights and isolate it with Ctrl+I, then H. Now to texture them, let's start from a light-emitting material for our light bulbs. I firstly created a base material so that our other material won't affect all the parts of our object, then created another one and called it light. As you see from the reference I provided you, the light bulbs of our headlight are on top and the bottom of each front light, so select these and assign our material to them. Now go here in the material properties and switch the surface type from principled BSDF to emission, then change the color to a vibrant yellow and increase the strength. Now use a mix node to blend this shader with a glossy BSDF with zero roughness at a factor of 0.8. Then to get our material a more natural look, create an Add Shader node to add a principled BSDF, which is going to have no roughness as well and is going to give a more luminous look to our light bulb. I forgot to apply this material to our other lights, which are on top of the ones we just did. Just select them and assign them the material in the material properties. And lastly, let's texture the body of our headlights. These little parts next to the bigger light bulbs are going to be of an opaque white, and the rest is going to be of a dark gray with a metallic of 0.227 and a roughness of 0.482. And if we unhide the rest of our car, we can see that she's looking gorgeous. But now let's focus on the back part of our car. Firstly, let's add another light so that we can see what we're doing, and then let's start with this grille behind our logo. From our textures folder, go into the back folder and drag these honeycomb textures into the shader editor, then connect them into our principled BSDF. If we add a color ramp between the color map and the base color input, we can modify the color of our whites so that our texture looks more like a grille. Then we can add another principled BSDF with a mix shader node so that we can start creating a cool gradient between these two textures. To do that, connect a gradient texture node to our mix node and give it a node wrangler. Then with the X location parameter of our mapping node, you can control the position of our gradient. And with a color ramp here, you can control the sharpness of the transition. But now let's pass on modifying the actual look of our material. I setted the metallicness to 1 for our second principled BSDF and lowered the roughness to 0.181, then setted the roughness of the first one to 0 and added a node wrangler to our honeycomb textures to fix their distorted look. To make this operation, we're going to need our UV editor, so reopen it and unwrap our model, then scale it precisely. Also make sure to straighten these faces onto the texture border with your 2D cursor, and after doing that, our grille is ready to go. Now let's quickly do our text logo and pass on the rear lights. For the outer part of the text, I made a simple black material with zero roughness and metallic. Then for the inner text, I created a simple material with the metallicness to 1 and the roughness to 0.5. Now we can finally pass to our rear lights. We firstly have to make this part behind our rear lights black, so I went into edit mode, temporarily disabled the solidify and subdivision modifiers, and started to color this hole with one of the black materials we made earlier. Then to brighten up our lights, I simply used the light material we did earlier and modified the emission and the principled BSDF colors to a vibrant red. And now for the final touch, let's texture the logo of our Aston Martin. I created a simple material with the metallic to 1 and the roughness to 0 for the front. Then I selected a face, pressed Shift+G to select similar by normal, inverted the selection with Ctrl+I, and assigned one of the black materials we made to these faces. I repeated the same process for the other logo on the back, and our car is finally ready to be captured. I set it up a simple plane underneath our car, extruded a wall behind it, and made a bevel to create a curve. Then I extended it to fit my view, moved the lights a little bit to get a better effect, and disabled the default light here in the World tab, then added a big light on top of the scene and created a camera. I aligned it with my view here in the View tab, then Align View and Align Active Camera to View. Finally, I added another plane inside the car so that the rear lights would not be visible from the front, setted my rendering samples to 4096 with no denoiser, and here is the final render. I hope you liked the content of this video. If you did, maybe let me know it by leaving a like, writing a comment, and maybe even following this channel to get updated about upcoming videos. Also, I wanted to thank you all for reaching 3,000 subscribers and for supporting me this much during this series. This said, let me know what you'd like to see in the future, and as always, see you in the next video.